Welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be checking out Brené Brown's Dare to Lead and really try to understand what daring leadership is all about. I mean, this book, it's incredible, packed with her research, personal stories, and tons of insight into what it takes to be a great leader.
Absolutely. We're going to explore vulnerability, perfectionism, and really look at how important it is to, embrace those difficult emotions that we all have at work. It might even make you think about leadership in a whole new way.
So one of Brown's big ideas is that to be a daring leader, you got to be okay with being vulnerable. And she actually tells this funny story about how she first thought sea level meant sea level.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. It shows how at first she wasn't even comfortable being open and honest in a professional setting.
Yeah, I think a lot of us can relate to that, not wanting to show all of ourselves at work. But what's so cool about Brown's research is that it shows vulnerability isn't weakness. It's actually where courage, innovation, and real connection come from.
And that whole thing about rumbling with vulnerability, it's like instead of avoiding those uncomfortable feelings, we got to face them head on.
Exactly. Brown says avoiding vulnerability is like trying to avoid, life itself. It's not going to work.
It's kind of like that part in Star Wars where Luke Skywalker goes into the cave on Dagobah. He had to confront his fears to grow as a Jedi.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like, we have to face our own vulnerabilities if we want to become authentic and courageous leaders.
Totally. And Brown says that one of the biggest things that keeps us from being vulnerable is, perfectionism.
She actually calls perfectionism a form of armor, something we use to protect ourselves from, feeling shame or judged. But the problem is that armor can really weigh us down. Brown actually points out how perfectionism can lead to, anxiety, depression, and even missed opportunities. Because we're so scared of not being perfect, we don't even try.
It's so true. And her own stories about struggling with perfectionism are really powerful, especially the one where she's talking about setting those crazy deadlines for herself, all because she was scared of not looking like a real leader.
It just goes to show how perfectionism can really make us overwork ourselves, to the point of burnout. And it can hurt our relationships with the people we work with, too.
So, okay, let's say vulnerability is like the foundation of daring leadership. Yeah. How do we build trust in the workplace? I mean, that's got to be huge for any team to actually do well at.
Absolutely. And Brown has this framework she calls the braving inventory. It's for, checking and building trust in relationships.
So what does braving stand for, and how do those behaviors actually help a team build trust?
Okay, so braving stands for boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. And they all work together. Like boundaries, for example, that means being clear about what you will and won't accept so everyone knows where they stand and feels respected. Yeah. And then there's reliability. It's about sticking to your promises and being someone people can depend on.
Okay, what about the other ones? The vault, integrity, non-judgment, generosity.
Sure. Well, vault is all about keeping things confidential. Being a safe space for people to share things without worrying they'll be gossiped about. Then you have integrity, doing what you say you'll do and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And non-judgment. That's about creating an environment where people can share their thoughts and feelings without being criticized. It's about listening and offering support without judging.
And generosity, what's that about?
That's kind of like giving people the benefit of the doubt, assuming they have good intentions. It's about looking for the best in people, even when they mess up. When all of those things are happening, you end up with a workplace where people feel safe and can trust each other.
Makes sense. And Brown says something else that's really interesting. She says that you have to trust yourself before you can trust anyone else.
Oh, for sure. If you don't trust yourself, how can you trust anyone else?
Right. And she talks about how we need to be okay with failure, which might sound kind of weird, but it makes sense when you think about it.
It's like failing is part of learning and growing. She even has this idea of the shitty first draft, admitting that anything we create, the first try is probably going to be messy.
It's so true. It kind of takes the pressure off, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And she's really honest about her own experiences, like when her husband gave her feedback about how she was setting these impossible expectations for herself.
It's a good reminder that we all have those moments where we need to look at ourselves and be like, okay, maybe I'm not being realistic here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's empathy. Brown says it's not just something you're born with, it's a skill you can learn and practice.
Yeah, she actually breaks it down into 4 parts. Seeing things from another person's perspective, not judging them, recognizing how they're feeling, and then actually letting them know you get it. She even tells this story about how she missed her daughter's soccer game, and the way her daughter and her husband reacted was totally different.
It's like a perfect example of what real empathy looks like.
Right. It makes you think about how you react when other people are going through something difficult.
Totally. And then Brown talks about how we can't just say we have certain values, we have to actually live them out. Like, she talks about this idea of assuming positive intent, which is easier said than done.
It's true. It takes real effort to believe that people are doing their best, even when they mess up.
And you have to be able to set boundaries too, right?
Definitely. You can't just let people walk all over you. And Brown makes this really important point. If you don't actually live out your values, people won't trust you. They can see right through it.
It's like that saying, actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Brown talks about all the ways we try to protect ourselves from vulnerability. She calls them the armory.
I love that metaphor. It's like,
Yeah.
we're putting on all this armor to keep ourselves safe, but then we can't really connect with anyone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious to hear more about these different kinds of armor and what they mean.
So Brown, she actually goes through a bunch of these pieces of armor, everything from like that perfectionism we talked about to cynicism. Let's stick with perfectionism for a second.
Okay, yeah.
What I find so interesting is like, why do we do it? Why do we strive for this perfection? And Brown says it's often because we're terrified of shame, you know? We want everyone to approve of us.
That's like we're trying to create this perfect image so people will like us.
Right, exactly. And she's like, hold on. Being perfect doesn't mean you're worthy.
It's something so many of us struggle with, I think.
For sure. And then there's this other one. She calls it foreboding joy. Have you ever felt that? Where you're happy, but then you're like waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like you can't even enjoy the good stuff because you're so worried something bad is going to happen.
Exactly. And Brown says that takes away from those happy moments. She wants us to like really be present and savor the good times, you know? Don't let the worry steal your joy.
It makes me think about how she talks about numbing, too. Like how we distract ourselves to avoid feeling uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah. Numbing. That's a big one. We all do it, right? Work too much, scroll through our phones endlessly.
It's like we're trying to shut off our feelings.
And Brown says it might feel good in the moment, but it doesn't actually fix anything. We're not really dealing with what's going on.
It's like we have to figure out what we're numbing and find healthier ways to deal with stress, right? Find things that actually make us feel good.
Exactly. And then she gets into this thing about the knower mentality, which is basically this idea that you have to have all the answers, be in control of everything.
So it's like a way of protecting yourself intellectually.
Yeah, like you can't be wrong, you can't be challenged. But it creates this environment where people are scared to speak up or disagree.
Which isn't good for anyone, right?
No, not at all. She's all about intellectual humility, being okay with saying, I don't know, and being open to learning from other people.
I love that. And then there's cynicism, which is kind of like assuming the worst in everything and everyone.
It's like this shield to protect yourself from getting disappointed, but it also keeps you from trusting people and seeing the good.
It's so negative.
Right. And Brown says we need to fight against that cynicism and try to see the good in people, hold on to hope.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
She also talks about control and compliance, like when leaders try to force people to do things their way.
It's like that old school top-down style of leadership, and it just doesn't work. It kills creativity and makes people resentful.
Because no one likes to be told what to do all the time,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Brown says we need leaders who empower people, who make them feel like they belong and that their work matters.
It's about inspiring people, not controlling them.
Right. And this kind of ties into what she says about burnout. When we're always pushing ourselves, not setting boundaries, we burn out.
Because we're human, not robots.
Exactly. We need rest. We need to have fun. Brown is big on taking care of ourselves.
It's like our society tells us we have to be busy all the time, but that's not sustainable.
Totally. Okay, this one's a little tricky, but she talks about how we sometimes work our shit out on other people.
What does that mean?
It's like when we haven't dealt with our own baggage, so we end up taking it out on the people around us.
Oh, so it's about being self-aware, understanding our own triggers and stuff.
Yeah, we got to do our own emotional work, so we're not dumping it on everyone else.
It's about taking responsibility, right?
Totally. Brown says it's about knowing yourself, what you're good at, what you struggle with, and being honest about how you contribute to problems.
So with this whole armory thing, it's like, yeah, we have these defenses, but we have to realize how they're holding us back.
It's about recognizing them, figuring out why we do them, and then finding healthier ways to deal with vulnerability.
Be more authentic.
Right. What about you? What really stuck with you from this whole armory section?
I think it's that foreboding joy thing. It's so real. Like, I catch myself doing it all the time.
Yeah, me too.
It's crazy how we sabotage our own happiness sometimes.
And Brown is like, no, celebrate the good things. Don't worry about what might happen.
And the numbing thing, too. It's so easy to fall into those traps, you know?
It's about being mindful of how we cope with things.
Yeah. And finding healthier ways to deal with those tough feelings.
Brown's work really makes you think about how you handle things emotionally. It's a journey, right?
Totally. So let's move on to trust. Brown really dives deep into how to build and maintain trust, especially in the workplace.
Yeah, and she says it's not something you can just demand. It takes time, consistent actions.
Show up, prove yourself.
Exactly. And she talks about the braving inventory again, but this time it's about using it to see how we can build trust with others.
It's a good framework for having honest conversations about trust, figuring out where the weak spots are.
For sure. You know what I found really interesting? That vault part, keeping things confidential.
That's a big one. She tells that story about how she accidentally shared something private with a colleague, and then it spread all over the place.
It's a good reminder to be careful who you trust and how important it is to be discreet.
I think accountability is huge, too.
Oh, absolutely. Daring leaders, they own their mistakes, they apologize, and they make things right.
They don't try to hide it.
Right. And Brown talks a lot about setting boundaries, which is something I think we could all get better at.
Boundaries at work, boundaries in our personal lives.
It's about knowing your limits and communicating them clearly. She even talks about the power of saying no, not taking on too much so you can actually do what you say you'll do.
Which goes back to that self-trust thing again.
Exactly. If you overcommit all the time, you end up breaking promises and then you lose trust in yourself. You know what I love? That analogy Brown uses about trust being like a marble jar.
Tell me about that.
So she learned it from her daughter, who used to give marbles to her friends when they did something trustworthy, like remembering her birthday or being kind. And over time, the jar would fill up.
It's like trust is built through these small, everyday actions, not big, flashy things.
Yeah. Exactly. It's about being reliable, being accountable, showing up consistently. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier with living out your values. If trust is important to you, you have to actually show it in your actions.
Not just talk about it.
Right. And Brown warns about this thing she calls fake vulnerability, which is basically pretending to be vulnerable to get something you want.
Manipulating people.
Yeah, and she gives these great examples of what that looks like. Like she talks about the CEO who tried to trick investors by acting all vulnerable.
So it's like vulnerability without boundaries can backfire.
Totally. It's not about using vulnerability as a tool. It's about connecting with people in a real, authentic way. Okay, let's switch gears a little. Let's talk about what happens when things go wrong, when we face setbacks.
That's where resilience comes in. And Brown has a whole framework for how to deal with failure and turn it into something positive.
It's all about that rumble, those uncomfortable feelings that come up when we screw up.
But she says running from those feelings isn't the answer.
Nope, you got to face them head on. It's like Luke in the cave again.
That's so true. And Brown uses that same analogy when she talks about how she used to set those crazy deadlines for herself. She realized it was because deep down, she was scared of not being good enough.
It just shows how if we can figure out why we do the things we do, we can actually start to change them. And she's big on being kind to ourselves through all of this.
Yeah, beating ourselves up doesn't help.
Not at all. There's this tool she talks about called the story making up exercise. It's about reframing how we think about those screw-ups.
Like, are we being realistic, or are we just making up the worst-case scenario in our heads?
Exactly. It's about questioning those assumptions, Is it really as bad as I think it is?
And she's really open about how she uses this tool herself.
Oh, yeah. That story about the lunch meat.
Classic.
It's hilarious, but it also shows how our emotions can really distort how we see things.
Like, maybe things aren't as bad as they seem. We just need to take a step back and look at the situation objectively.
Right. And Brown talks about how we can't just dump all our emotions on other people.
Which is tempting sometimes.
Oh, for sure. But it's not fair to them. It's our responsibility to deal with our own feelings. She talks about, chandeliering.
Chandeliering. What's that?
It's like when you hold everything in and then you just explode.
Oh, I get it.
Right. Or there's bouncing, which is when you constantly go to other people for validation and sympathy.
Instead of dealing with it yourself.
Exactly. Brown says we need to learn how to regulate our emotions, name them, understand them, and deal with them in a healthy way.
It's like that whole rumble thing again. The more comfortable we are with our own emotions, the less we need to dump them on other people.
Exactly. And she talks about how important it is to find calm, especially when things are crazy.
Calm is a superpower.
Right. It's about not overreacting, staying level-headed, and it's contagious. If you're calm, it can help other people calm down too.
It creates a more peaceful environment.
Exactly. She talks about things like breathing exercises to calm your nervous system and curiosity.
Curiosity.
Yeah, like asking questions instead of jumping to conclusions and taking breaks when you need them. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of self-awareness.
Makes sense. So what about you? What did you find most helpful in terms of embracing failure?
I think for me, it's that self-compassion piece. It's so easy to beat yourself up when you make a mistake.
It's like our default setting.
Right. But Brown reminds us that everyone makes mistakes. It's part of being human.
And we should be as kind to ourselves as we would be to a friend.
Exactly. And that story I'm making up exercise, that's a game changer. It helps you see when you're spiraling and catastrophizing.
Reminding yourself that your thoughts aren't always facts.
Right. Brown's whole approach to failure is so empowering. It's not about avoiding it. It's about learning from it and becoming more resilient.
Love it. Welcome back to our last part on Dare to Lead. We've talked about vulnerability, resilience, empathy, and all those things that make a daring leader.
And now we're going to get practical. Like, how can you actually use the stuff in your everyday life?
That's what I'm excited about. I already feel like I'm learning so much from this book.
Me too. And Brown, she says, you don't have to make these huge changes, you know? It's about those small, consistent things that really add up.
Okay, so where do we start? Like, what's the first step?
Well, Brown talks about this thing called creating a square squad.
What's a square squad?
So it's basically about figuring out who are those people whose opinions you really value, the people who support you and will tell you the truth, even when it's hard.
The people who will help you grow, right?
Exactly. And she says write down their names on like a little piece of paper, small enough to fit in your wallet.
So you can carry it with you.
Yeah, it's like a reminder of who you can count on. And then tell those people how much you appreciate them.
Just let them know you're grateful for them.
Right. It strengthens those relationships and reminds you that you don't have to do this alone. Now, here's another thing. We all have fears, those things that hold us back.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And Brown, she's like, you got to name those fears, face them head on. Don't let them control you.
She calls it entering the cave, right? Like facing those vulnerabilities.
Exactly like Luke Skywalker going into the cave on Dagobah. It's scary, but that's where the growth happens.
You have to go through the tough stuff to get to the good stuff.
Exactly. And sometimes just writing those fears down can help. Get them out of your head and onto paper.
It's like you're taking away some of their power.
Right. And then Brown says, think about those fears. Like, what if they could actually help you grow? Instead of asking, what if I fail? Ask, what can I learn from this?
Turn that fear into curiosity.
Exactly. And then there's self-trust. That's huge for daring leadership. If you don't trust yourself, no one else will.
Right. You have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
And Brown says, go back to that braving inventory, but this time ask yourself those questions. Like, do I trust myself to set boundaries? Am I reliable? Do I hold myself accountable?
It's like looking inward instead of outward.
Exactly. Are your actions matching up with your values? And remember, self-trust, it takes time, it takes practice.
It's a journey.
Exactly. Now, Brown's a big fan of gratitude. We talked about that earlier with the Square Squad, but it's something you can do every day.
Like, just take a minute to be thankful for the good things in your life.
Yeah. She suggests starting each day by thinking of 3 things you're grateful for. It could be anything.
A good cup of coffee, the sunshine, your family.
Anything. It helps you focus on the positive, even when things are tough. And celebrate your wins, too.
Don't let those good moments slip by.
Exactly. Keep a victory log. Write down your accomplishments, big or small.
I love that. It's like a reminder of how far you've come.
Right. It builds your confidence. Okay, so as we wrap up Dare to Lead, what do you think is the most important message?
For me, it's that anyone can be a leader. You know, it's not about your title or position. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable, to connect with people, to lead with your heart.
It's about choosing courage over comfort, vulnerability over armor, empathy over apathy. It's not always easy, but it's worth it.
It's powerful stuff.
It is. Now, before we go, let's do a quick recap. 10 key takeaways from Dare to Lead.
Sounds good.
Number 1, daring leadership is about being vulnerable, showing up as your true self, even when it's scary.
Number 2, vulnerability is not weakness. It's actually the source of courage and connection.
Number 3, perfectionism is a trap. Let it go.
Number 4, build trust through the braving inventory. Boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity.
Number 5, trust yourself first. It's the foundation for trusting others.
Number 6, embrace failure. It's part of the process. Learn from it and move on.
Number 7, deal with those tough emotions. Write your shitty first draft. Be kind to yourself.
Number 8, practice empathy. It's a skill you can develop.
Number 9, make your values mean something. Put them into action every day.
And number 10, show up with your whole heart. Be brave, be authentic, be kind.
That's it. That's daring leadership. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful. Keep daring greatly.